And welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, as always, Dennis Dunicic. Before we begin today, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Join our growing international community. Now let's get into our report today, which concerns a Russian bombing in the Ukrainian city of Mariupol. Now, as we have covered before, Mariupol is a strategically important port city on the Sea of Azov in southern Ukraine. Now, for roughly the past week, Mariupol has been under siege, facing heavy Russian bombardment. And as the war continues, as has been happening across the entirety of Ukraine, and every city and village that is under attack, Russian bombardments have become significantly more indiscriminate. At the beginning of the war, Russian attacks seemed to focus on military targets and other major infrastructural buildings. Though now, Russian bombardments, attacks, and general military offensives seem to be covering whatever they can attack. Now, today, a Ukrainian maternity ward was struck with a Russian missile, injuring 17 individuals. Now, this story, even though to many of you it may seem just as another casualty of war, the fact is, attacking defenseless, hopeless, weak, and vulnerable targets in any military offensive is fundamentally a war crime and is about as depraved as it gets. Now, war is one of humanity's, if not humanity's, worst characteristics. It is naturally occurring. And that being said, when war does occur, even as terrible as it is, some general rules are followed. Over the ages, centuries, and our storied history of conflict, combat, and outright war, we as human beings have developed general international guidelines that we follow when we are in conflict. Now, these are followed under the basic principle that we should avoid seeing the darkest aspects of war, which are the targeting of the weak and defenseless and other crimes that are completely unavoidable and serve no strategic purpose. Now, that being said, war crimes and violations of general war ethics are committed all of the time, not just in the conflict in Ukraine, but it has occurred in the conflicts in the Middle East, which participated or were instigated by the United States, in the conflict that's happening in Ethiopia, definitely in the conflict that happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the genocide that occurred, and other genocides that have occurred throughout world history. Nonetheless, it is expected that when a world power is conducting an invasion or some kind of military offensive, that it generally follows these guidelines. Now, a maternity ward, typically, maternity wards are filled with medical staff, mothers, and newborn children. Fundamentally, it doesn't get more weak or defenseless as that. A mother that has just given birth is not fully capable of moving or leaving out of the way of a military strike. A newborn baby is a fucking newborn baby. And this particular attack on the maternity ward actually pulls a personal string of mine. I was born in a hospital in the city of Bihać during the War of Bosnia and Herzegovina. My hospital was bombed while I was in there as a newborn baby. And this just brings back some of the more parallels that can be seen with what's going on in Ukraine and the events that occurred in the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which historically, in contemporary history, at least in Europe, can be viewed as the most brutal, inhumane, and darkest war that has occurred. Now, some similar things are beginning to happen more and more often in Ukraine, particularly indiscriminate bombings and the growing humanitarian crisis in the country. Now, so far, it has been estimated that 2 million refugees have left their homes in Ukraine and left the country, primarily to nations like Poland and Hungary, though other European nations and even the United States. I should mention that a very small minority have gone to Belarus and Russia. This has caused a massive migration crisis. And not just that, there are countless internally displaced individuals who no longer live in their places of residence. In fact, many farms and residential buildings have been used by Russian soldiers to set up artillery bases or other strategic locations to send out more missile attacks. Ukraine is losing its people, and the people that are still in the cities that are under attack, cities like Kiev, Mariupol, Sumy, and many, many others, are experiencing non-stop Russian aerial attacks, artillery attacks, missiles, rockets, and ground offensives, particularly the latter occurring in Kiev. Now, at the beginning of this war, I mentioned that Russia was particularly targeting military and strategic, genuine targets of military offenses. Though as the war continues, this continues to decrease, and Russian attacks are attacking whatever they can. Now, the reason for this, generally speaking, is that at the beginning of the invasion, the Russian military experienced a massive amount of momentum. When this offensive and when this invasion began, many people thought Ukraine is going to fall within 72 hours max. But Ukraine has held on. We are well into the second week of invasion now. And the reality is the Russian invasion has stalled massively, facing an unexpectedly strong resistance and an unexpectedly high amount of Russian military casualties. And this has caused Russia and its military forces in Ukraine to become growingly desperate. As they increase in desperation, they are beginning to use tactics that generally are violations of basic humanitarian principles that occur within wars. Attacking any targets they can, residential, hospital buildings, schools, etc. Even if there are not as many people in these buildings, admittedly, the vast majority of Ukrainians who have not already fled are hiding in underground bunkers where they are relatively safe from bombardment. The destruction of their homes, the destruction of their schools, the destruction of their hospitals, the destruction of their cities has a mental effect on the Ukrainian people and is making it more likely that Ukraine gives up and is making it more likely that Ukraine falls and is making it more likely that Russia is victorious. This is a desperate military tactic, though it's not one that will not come without consequence. Internationally, Russia has already ostracized itself, though attacks like this are going to increase the ostracization and probably push for even heavier sanctions. And yes, they've already been heavy, but they can get much, much worse. But this report wants to focus on the human cost of the war. Since the beginning of the invasion, thousands of people have died, both soldiers on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, and unfortunately many civilians. Now, when you look at recent events, specifically in the city of Mariupol, which has been facing the heaviest amount of aerial bombardment or missiles or aerial explosive attacks, civilians, along with soldiers, have been had to be buried in mass graves by Ukrainian officials. Mass graves are a chilling aspect of war. Individuals who have families, who have their own lives, who have their own style of living and their own identity are being buried one next to another in unmarked mass graves. That is fucking dark. Now, the reality is as this conflict continues, the human cost is going to increase. Now, I'm not going to speculate on whether or not Russia is intentionally targeting civilians. I will say my personal belief. I actually don't think that it's intentional. I don't think that Russia is going out of its way by any means to not target civilians. Okay, that is very clear. But I also don't believe that Russia is going out of its way just to kill Ukrainians who are not fighting for their country. The reality is Russia is on an all-out offensive, and civilian casualties are bound to happen. This would occur in any war or any kind of conflict. Now, Russian and Ukrainian forces and government officials are well aware of this fact, and this has caused them to begin negotiations on establishing a ceasefire. Currently, a ceasefire is ongoing. Now, the purpose of this ceasefire is not to continue peace talks, at least for what we publicly know. The public purpose of this ceasefire is to take civilians in cities like Kiev, Mariupol, Sumy, etc., and give them an opportunity to leave their cities and head to primarily Western Ukraine, which has not been under major Russian attack or under Russian bombardment. The most western portions of Ukraine are relatively safe. Many of these civilians will end up moving from Western Ukraine to the rest of Europe. Now, The reality is these ceasefires have created what we covered yesterday that are known as humanitarian corridors. But the reality is attempts at ceasefires like this before have failed, with them being agreed upon, civilians going out, and fire and rushing shelling continuing to happen. Now, it should be stated that previous failed ceasefire attempts by the Ukrainian government have been blamed on Russian forces for attacking these corridors or the civilians leaving, while Vladimir Putin himself has personally blamed nationalist Ukrainians for attacking the corridors themselves. The reality is that the evidence likely points that this is Russia attacking these ceasefire corridors, but again, allegations have been made on both sides and we need to present them as such. The purpose of this report is just to state that as this conflict continues, the human cost is going to increase. More civilians are going to continue to die, even as most begin to evacuate. And the costs, the bloodshed, the death, and the infrastructural damage can hurt all of us. Recently, we covered how the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant had a fire breakout during a Russian attack last week. Today, what has occurred in the now decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear power plant was a loss of power. Now, yes, many of you understand that Chernobyl is decommissioned and it's no longer functioning due to the fucking catastrophe that happened in the 80s. But there is many leftover radioactive fuel that is stored inside the now decommissioned nuclear power plant. And this radioactive fuel requires cooling or air conditioning, which requires electricity to stay cold and not seep out and cause a radioactive crisis. The longer this war continues, the larger the human cost is going to be. It is in the interest of everyone for this conflict to end, no matter on whose side it is favorable towards. Let me know what you think. Let me know of any potential solutions you see of some kind of diplomatic compromise being made to finally end this crisis. And let me know how you think the situation is going to develop. Thanks for tuning in. One more time, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.